It is a story told in bronze and concrete, in wind and earth, and in the wrinkles of an old cottonwood tree. A story few people know or connect with the Civil War. It is a story about a man, half white, half Cheyenne, fighting as a Confederate soldier and a Cheyenne warrior. It is a story about a battle for freedom and human rights. A story as fierce and emotional as the struggle over slavery between North and South. On November 29, 1864, as Union General William Tecumseh Sherman marches to the sea, approximately 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians are killed at Sand Creek in Colorado Territory. Most of the dead are women, children, or elderly, including many chiefs.
Chief White Antelope, when he saw the soldiers shooting into the lodges, made up his mind not to live any longer. He stood in front of his lodge with his arms folded across his breast, singing the death song. George Bent, witness to the Sand Creek Massacre.
Essentially, what had existed here for thousands of years was wiped out in an instant, along with an attempt to literally wipe out my people, my ancestors.
In the 1830s, many years before the massacre at Sand Creek, there is a steady flow of Americans, New Mexicans, Native Americans, and French Canadians in and out of a great adobe fort on the Santa Fe Trail. Traders, tribes, and trappers come to the eastern plains of Colorado to swap what they have for something they want even more. They trade furs, food, guns, blankets, even soap and jewelry, and an extremely valuable commodity of the day, buffalo robes.
William Bent was a trader. Bent's Fort was just not a trading center, it was a cultural center. And William Bent had achieved a very close relationship with the Cheyenne. He married not only Owl Woman, who was a daughter of the Arrow Keeper, but two other daughters. That gave him tremendous prestige.
William Bent and Owl Woman go on to have 4 children, including George Bent. The bustling fort and Indian village give the Bent children a rare window on the world. George picks up English, Spanish, and several Indian languages.
George Bent was caught between the Native American world and the white world, if you will. That goes all the way back to his childhood when he spent time at a place like Bent's Fort with his father, and when he spent time out in the Cheyenne villages with his mother and his Cheyenne family.
He learns to ride horses, early training to be a hunter and warrior. But George can't outrun tragedy. He is only 4 when his mother dies after giving birth to his sister, Julia. Keeping with Cheyenne tradition, William Bent marries Yellow Woman and Island, Owl Woman sisters, who raise all of the Bent children, including Charlie, George's half-brother. In many ways, life along the Santa Fe Trail is starting to change, shaping George's life and the land forever.
Emigration to California and Oregon began about 1842, and even as early as 1845, the Indians were beginning to grow restless under this heavy movement of whites through the heart of their hunting grounds. George Bent.
George Bent, his influence is pretty hard to exaggerate. He wanted a record of the Cheyennes and he was the one to tell it.
George Bent was one of the primary witnesses we have to look to, among others, that were actually in the village.
We've always known about Sand Creek. We should never forget. I think it's harder too when you know that these were your grandmas and your grandpas, you know, and your aunties and your uncles and your brothers and your sisters.
Believing it was their destiny, wagon trains with people full of hope ship out from the east seeking the seemingly endless bounty of the west to make a new life.
The Mexican War validated, if you will, the notion of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was itself an outgrowth of the most basic principles of American democracy: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The attitude then was, we have the right, as a part of our rights, to take the land. It's our land by superior right.
As the war with Mexico winds down, a treaty is signed, and the United States ultimately takes possession of the northern half of what had been Mexico. The newly acquired territory makes up most of what is now known as the American West. Golden grasses of the prairie give way to the churning wheels of gold hunters' wagons as the 49ers believe their destiny awaits them out west, in the mountains of one of the United States' newest possessions, California.
The federal government discovers that by encouraging westward expansion, it's created a new set of dilemmas for itself, including the question of what to do with Indian peoples who are contending with what, to their eyes, looks very, very much like an invasion.
The Cheyennes and Arapahoes, who lived and hunted in the country between the Platte and the Arkansas, found themselves caught between two great streams of white immigration. Groves of cottonwood trees, where Indians had camped in winter for generations, disappeared in a single season. The buffalo began to decrease with alarming rapidity, and the tribes foresaw the hungry years to come.
During the U.S. war with Mexico, trade had been choked off along the Santa Fe Trail, and by the late 1840s, Bent's Fort, the castle on the plains, begins to fall by the wayside. Then, in 1849, a cholera outbreak runs rampant.
It decimated the tribes, but particularly the Cheyenne, who lost, the Southern Cheyenne lost perhaps half of their population. So Bent's Fort became a place of sadness where too many deaths occurred.
In an effort to resolve the growing tension with Native Americans over land and resources, the Fort Laramie Treaty pledges provisions and defines the boundaries of the Plains tribes.
And that treaty was to last as long as the grass shall grow, and the waters shall flow, forever. And forever was actually less than 10 years.
The ground at Sand Creek is very sacred to our peoples. They burned all the teepees, lodges, pipes, medicine, and they were piled with the lodges stacked in a way that one of my grandfathers told me, is that the medicines and the pipes and the stuff still on the ground. We asked the spirits to let us come in and pay homage.
William Bent has abandoned the old fort and moves his family about 35 miles down the Arkansas River to a place called Big Timbers. Bent's new fort, a stone structure, becomes known far and wide as a landmark along the Santa Fe Trail.
During the 1850s, during the period when William Bent operated Bent's new fort, it served multiple purposes. It was a trading post, that's true, but it was also a place where immigrants and travelers could resupply, that type of thing. From that place, they would hold talks with the various tribes.
The dispersal of government annuities, food and supplies promised in treaty agreements also takes place here. William Bent wants his children to get a formal education and learn the ways of his white ancestry, so they are sent hundreds of miles away to Missouri. George eventually attends school in St. Louis, William's birthplace.
Each pupil must furnish towels, napkins, napkin ring, slippers, and umbrella.
As George pursues his studies and learns the ways of city life, prospectors out to strike it rich discover gold at the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. Unbridled cries of Pike's Peak or bust fill the air as gold fever takes hold in 1858 and 59. Tens of thousands of gold hunters set off on a rush through hell and high water to reach gold diggings on the western edge of Kansas Territory, soon to be known as the town of Denver.
Gold changes everything. Suddenly the trails are filled not with traders or settlers bound for Oregon, they're coming to stay. And the impact on the Indians was immediate. Suddenly, places that had been devoid of these people were now full of them. And there was the adjustment. How do we deal with one another? How are we going to get along?
William Bent is in the middle of it all, both as an entrepreneur at Bent's new fort and as an Indian agent appointed by the U.S. government in 1859. He appeals to his superiors to continue providing annuities and merchandise to the tribes.
And he expressed his concerns over and over again for his life and the danger that he felt because the Indians were starving. He wrote in one of his letters that the Indians were being pushed from all sides by the gold rush, by the people coming up from Texas. And the only thing they had left was to fight back.
Bent tries to maintain peace, but he is unable to sway leadership to uphold federal treaty obligations. The Treaty of Fort Laramie is broken. William resigns as Indian agent and leases his fort to the Army. Taking advantage of Bent's new fort's prominence and strategic location, the U.S. Army builds Fort Wise next to the once booming trading post. In 1861, the Fort Wise Treaty further reduces Cheyenne and Arapaho territory to less than 10% of the land promised in the Fort Laramie Treaty.
The difficulty is that it only applied to a very few of the Cheyennes and Arapahoes, whereas the Cheyennes and the Arapahoes did not consider any treaty binding on them unless all of the bands were party to the treaty.
Meanwhile, Frederick Douglass and John Brown spark the abolitionist movement, and the conflict over slavery boils over back east.
President Abraham Lincoln freed slaves after several hundred years of slavery, and in the same breath subjugated our people, Cheyenne people.
the Civil War emerges out of this fight for who's going to control the West, and for whether or not the West will have slavery or whether it's going to be free soil. That discussion, though, leaves out the fact that there are Indian peoples who already live in the West.
George Bent, whose father owns a slave and whose mother was Cheyenne, is caught up in these tumultuous times.
I found the whole of western Missouri arming for the South. It did not take me long to make up my mind to enlist. George Bent.
George and some of his schoolmates decided to join the Missouri State Guard, which was a Confederate organization in St. Louis. In the next year and a half of his life, he would fight as a warrior. He would fight as a warrior for the Confederate Army. George saw his first action in a very famous battle called Wilson's Creek.
George goes on to fight at Lexington, Missouri, and in 1862 at the Battle of Pea Ridge before being captured in Mississippi later that year. With the help of family connections, George is paroled and released after giving an oath that he will not take any further part in the war.
I will oppose secession.
He promises to return home. George returns west to his father's ranch at the junction of the Purgatoire and Arkansas rivers in the Colorado Territory. He sees sights he couldn't have previously imagined.
I found everything in the upper country greatly changed. Stage stations and ranches every few miles. Denver was a city, and a score of other towns had been founded.
As the Civil War grinds on, Fort Wise, now named Fort Lyon after fallen General Nathaniel Lyon, becomes a pivotal Union outpost.
When George Bent returned to Colorado after he had been paroled, he lived with his father, but he was an unreconstructed rebel. And so he moved with his mother's people, the Cheyenne.
The mountains of Colorado are now producing a steady supply of gold, a boon for the Union war effort. Millions of dollars in gold dust is mined early on in the war, much of it minted in Denver. But Confederates have their eyes on the gold too. There are many Southern sympathizers in the region, and an organized Confederate effort is on its way from Texas. At Glorieta Pass, New Mexico, Confederate troops from Texas clash with a Union contingent of Colorado and New Mexico volunteers. It is a decisive victory for the Union in a battle now known as the Gettysburg of the West.
John Chivington gained a reputation for himself at the Battle of Glorieta Pass, where he led a number of troops on a pretty elaborate maneuver and captured some supply lines from Confederate forces.
And the hero of Glorieta, Major Chivington, now becomes Colonel Chivington, the commander of the 1st Colorado.
On the same day as the Battle of Glorieta Pass, President Lincoln appoints John Evans governor of Colorado Territory.
He was not just to govern the territory, but he was to promote the Republican Party. He sees the prospect of, if we can get the Transcontinental Railroad through Colorado, then this is going to lead to an economic boom like you can only imagine now. But the focus was get the land question done first. And in order to get the land question resolved, he had to come to some sort of an accommodation with the Cheyennes and Arapahoes.
Land, of course, was very important to the expansion of the various railroads. I've heard a comment made that real estate was where people made their riches in Colorado, not gold.
So you have the federal process, if you will, the seizure of land, seizure of resources, the wiping out of our food supply, the massive buffalo herds, for railroads, for farming, for ranching.
Rumor and rhetoric about skirmishes between Native Americans and settlers create fear in the burgeoning Colorado Territory. Propaganda implies Native Americans are wholly supporting the Confederate side. The settlers feel vulnerable to Indian attack, as many of the territory's U.S. volunteer soldiers leave to fight the Civil War battles back east.
As far as Lincoln's concerned, I think he had priorities, and the Union was his priority, the chief one. And so this left an unsettled feeling in the West.
There aren't enough soldiers to contain Indians within the Fort Wise Treaty boundaries, and the treaty itself, though ratified, is neither signed nor supported by most of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribal bands and their chiefs. Yet in 1863, Governor Evans sees an opportunity to make a move.
He unilaterally suddenly said, this reservation applies to all of the Cheyennes and Arapahoes.
Colorado territorial officials argue that the Fort Wise Treaty is a solemn obligation, and if the Indians do not hold to the agreement, they should be considered as hostile. The Cheyenne are still trying to live their nomadic way of life. By early 1863, George and his brother Charlie are both living with the tribe, but things aren't the same. Buffalo are becoming scarce. Hunger and frustration are rising along with confrontations with soldiers.
With the coming of the war, the regular army, just lock, stock, and barrel, went back east. And so that the management of the military now passed to the settlers. So instead of being a barrier between the settlers and the Indians, they were the agent of the settlers.
They did not dream what a hornet's nest they were stirring up.
During the spring of 1864, in response to reported raids on cattle ranches, U.S. troops launch attacks on Cheyenne villages at Fremont's Orchard and Cedar Canyon. Cheyenne Chief Lean Bear, wearing a peace medal from a visit to the Lincoln White House a year earlier, approaches a group of U.S. volunteers from Colorado on the western plains of Kansas, where he is gunned down. That same spring, on a ranch not far from Denver, Nathan Hungate and his family of 4 are brutally murdered.
Some of the descriptions about what had happened to these people and so forth were horrendous. They were exhumed and they were taken to Denver and they were displayed for the public in Denver. Well, the effect was a ghastly effect that exacerbated the whole feeling of paranoia that there was an imminent attack. The Cheyennes are blamed, the Arapahos are blamed, the Sioux are blamed, and the all-encompassing Indians are blamed.
It is never proven who is responsible, but the settlers demand vengeance for the atrocities, and the Cheyenne seek retribution for the killing of Chief Lean Bear.
There was this feeling that there was this imminent threat out there from the Plains tribes, but then the Plains tribes felt that there was an imminent threat of attack from these soldiers. Paranoia ran rampant in both circles, both cultures.
Into the Great Valley, the war parties of the Cheyennes and Sioux broke, chasing the coaches, running off stock, and forcing their freighters to corral their trains and freight. They had been attacked again and again by the troops without any cause, and they were retaliating in the only way they knew how: George Bent.
Yet Chiefs White Antelope and Black Kettle see no way out but to make peace, even when Cheyenne are attacked. Influenced by his mixed heritage, George Bent is unwilling to make war on whites. His father has always worked for peace. but fear and the fight for limited resources rule the day.
With increasing contact came increasing misunderstandings. War was not inevitable. Nothing in history is.
It was very moving, it was emotional, very heartbreaking to locate the place, the actual place where the soldiers piled the belongings into a big old fire pit.
They're not at rest. They're not at peace. They never got a chance to. We've heard them hollering and crying. When are they going to be at peace?
In 1864, Colorado Territorial Governor John Evans is at a crossroads. He needs to quell the fear of settlers, bring Colorado into the Union, and secure Indian lands to build the proposed transcontinental railroad.
Evans has spent a great deal of time in the summer of 1864 sending dispatches back to federal authorities, warning them that Colorado Territory was imperiled not just by the native peoples, but also by this Confederate menace that was looming out there. He knew that this was a way that he was quite possibly going to be able to convince skeptics that they should divert federal forces away from other Civil War hotspots and send them back into Colorado Territory.
In June of 1864, Evans issues a proclamation offering friendly Indians safe haven. In August, he issues a new proclamation calling on all patriotic citizens, either alone or in groups, to attack and kill any hostile Plains Indians they encounter. In response to his appeals to Washington, the War Department authorizes Evans to start recruiting a 100-day volunteer regiment of U.S. soldiers.
It was very hastily put together. A lot of the soldiers, rather than being disciplined and trained how to operate as soldiers, they came in with probably all the baggage that had been promoted throughout the spring and summer of 1864 by the press, which was this paranoia.
The new regiment, known as the 3rd Colorado, serves under John Chivington, ordained minister and hero for the Union at the Battle of Glorieta Pass. He is now a colonel and Colorado Military District Commander.
Some say that he had some Indian blood in him, but his feelings were that the savages, as he called them, were pagans, people without souls, and therefore not people at all.
In Denver, Chivington and Governor Evans recognize political advantages in attacking the Indians, but after Cheyenne and Arapaho chiefs make appeals for peace, Evans reluctantly presides over negotiations at Camp Weld in September of 1864. Prominent Cheyenne and Arapaho leaders, including Peace Chiefs Black Kettle and White Antelope, join the delegation. Major Edward Winecoop, Captain Silas Soule, Colonel Chivington, and Governor Evans represent the Colorado Territory. Speaking through an interpreter, Chief Black Kettle makes a powerful first impression.
All we ask is that we may have peace with whites. We want to hold you by the hand. We have been traveling through a cloud. The sky has been dark ever since the war began. Chief Black Kettle.
Evans, who is also Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Colorado Territory, knows that Chief Black Kettle doesn't speak for all Cheyennes and seems unwilling to negotiate peace.
Your young men are on the warpath. My soldiers are preparing for the fight. It is utterly out of the question for you to be at peace with us while living with our enemies. Governor John Evans.
The Cheyenne and Arapaho delegates are puzzled by the mixed messages from Governor Evans and Colonel Chivington. but they leave with a handshake. Major Wynkoop, who brokered the meeting, returns to his command at Fort Lyon. Chiefs White Antelope and Black Kettle, and many more Cheyenne and Arapaho, travel to camp at the fort, believing that the prospects for peace are good. Major Wynkoop is soon given a change of command from Fort Lyon and is replaced by Major Scott Anthony, who is no friend to the Indians.
When he got there, he did not like the situation. Indians were not supposed to be in the vicinity of a fort, so he tells them to basically to leave. He's unhappy with the situation that he finds there.
We believed in the federal government. We believed in what we were told. We believed when we signed some documents that those had meaning, and we come to find out that they don't. We believed.
It is late November 1864. More than 600 Cheyenne and about 50 Arapahoes camp at Sand Creek. The site is about 40 miles from Fort Lyon and Bent's new fort. They camp on land legally theirs under the Fort Wise Treaty and believe they are under military protection.
This place was well known to all Cheyenne and Arapahoes, and they used it as a camping ground for many years. Our camp was near one of the places where there was running water. These people were the most friendly ones in the two tribes.
They were waiting for news to come in to the Indian Agency at Fort Lyon from the soldiers whether or not negotiations for peace would continue or discontinue.
Governor Evans goes back east. Here is Chivington's opportunity. He's got to do something quick or the 3rd Colorado is going to be gone. They're already being called the Bloodless Third, so he has to make his move.
On the 28th of November, Chivington and roughly 800 soldiers of the 1st and 3rd Regiment showed up at the doorstep of Fort Lyon.
Captain Soule, who encountered him on the road before he reached Fort Lyon, was absolutely shocked to see him.
At Fort Lyon, marching orders were issued.
And one after another, these junior officers said, "This is not right."
They told him that it would be murder to attack that peaceful village at Sand Creek.
They've been promised protection. They're there under the truce.
Chivington roared back, "Damn any man who's in sympathy with Indians." And that's the way he felt.
After a night-long march from Fort Lyon, Chivington and about 675 troops of the 1st and 3rd Regiments of Cavalry, Colorado Volunteers, arrive at Sand Creek with 4 mountain howitzers, rifles, pistols, and swords. The troops are under control of the U.S. War Department. The 1st is a well-trained veteran battalion. The 3rd is poorly trained and made up of 100-day volunteers, many with rage toward Indians. Before dawn breaks, Chiefs Black Kettle, White Antelope, Left Hand, among other headmen, together with about 650 Cheyenne and Arapaho under their leadership, start their day. Some members of the tribes are stoking up morning campfires, while others are checking on the village's horse herds.
Chief Black Kettle had a large American flag tied to the end of a long lodgepole. He called to the people not to be afraid, that the soldiers would not hurt them. Then, the troops opened fire from 2 sides of the camps. George Bent.
You would think it impossible for white men to butcher and mutilate human beings as they did there. Silas Soule, Captain, 1st Colorado Cavalry, United States Army.
Of the 200 Cheyennes and Arapahos that were killed here, 150 or more were women, children, and some elderly. And a like number of wounded.
We ran up the creek with the cavalry following us, and the dry bed of the stream was now a terrible sight. Men, women, and children lying thickly scattered on the sand, some dead, and the rest too badly wounded to move. George Bent.
George Bent was seriously wounded in the hip and barely escaped with his life.
The Cheyennes and Arapahos that had survived go back down the stream or the stream valley to find relatives that were dead or wounded.
There we were, on that bleak, frozen plain, without any shelter, and not a stick of wood to build a fire with. Most of us were wounded and half naked. It was bitter cold. The wind made a full sweep over the ground on which we lay. That night will never be forgotten.
There are a large number of Cheyenne and Arapaho camping at the Smoky Hill River, many miles away from Sand Creek. Their bonfires by the cottonwoods beckon the survivors to safety. Nearly all of Arapaho Chief Left Hand's band were killed at Sand Creek. Mortally wounded, Chief Left Hand dies at the Smoky Hill camps.
Everyone was crying, even the warriors, and the women and children screaming and wailing. Nearly everyone present had lost some relations or friends. And many of them in their grief were gashing themselves with their knives until the blood flowed in streams.
There was at that time with the Cheyenne people, both the northern and southern Cheyenne, a council of 44 chiefs. And a significant number of those chiefs were killed at Sand Creek. And it's kind of like wiping out maybe a third or half of Congress.
At first, it is seen as a great victory over hostile Indians. The troops, returning with scalps and other human trophies, are met with celebration on the streets of Denver.
But it was then that some of the people got to see firsthand that this may not have been exactly what they expected.
News of Sand Creek spreads quickly in Colorado and back east.
The congressional investigations were initiated by 2 letters. In them, the 2 soldiers described the horrors of Sand Creek, described the mutilations, described the killing of babies, of pregnant women.
Authors of the letters, Lieutenant Joe Kramer and Captain Silas Soule, had defied Chivington prior to and during the attack at Sand Creek. Soule's company of 1st Colorado veterans refused to fire a shot.
On the same day that Sand Creek occurred, Sherman was marching through Georgia. On the same day that Sand Creek, there was still a siege at Petersburg. The same day, the Army in Tennessee was facing a major engagement. In just about every one of those episodes, the number of casualties greatly exceed Sand Creek. Yet insofar as I've been able to determine, the only event that took place in the Civil War that was the subject of 2 separate congressional investigations and a military commission was Sand Creek.
The colonel himself is exposed, but since he has already resigned from the military, he cannot be court-martialed. Just weeks after his testimony, Silas Soule is assassinated in Denver. His murderers are identified, but never brought to justice.
The feeling is pretty hard to describe, you know. You live with that. Imagine that going on. It stays with you.
It wasn't a battle. We were scattered across the land, killed. We were running for our lives.
Getting killed the way they did, the way they killed them. Imagine. I can't imagine how they could still, still want to live.
Most of the Sand Creek survivors have moved to a huge winter camp.
It's a pan-tribal camp. It's got Arapahos and Cheyennes and some Lakotas and Brule and many others. And from that camp, they do something that, at least for white observers, seems unprecedented. They begin launching winter raids.
We set out about 1,000 strong. George Bent, Cheyenne warrior.
He joined the dog soldiers in attacks on white settlements, wagon trains, ranches.
Within weeks, Julesburg, an important stage station along the South Platte River, is attacked.
And they attacked not only there, but on a front 100 miles long, destroying every ranch, every stage station, every wagon train. George Bent said that at night the fires lit the heavens. Denver was absolutely isolated.
John Chivington, as he's claiming to have quieted this region with this heroic blow at Sand Creek, in fact, it's quite the opposite. He's incited a general Indian war.
But George Bent still finds himself torn between 2 worlds. Many Cheyenne moved south of the Arkansas River with Chief Black Kettle, who even after Sand Creek wants no part of war. George Bent joins them, eventually marrying Black Kettle's niece. In the spring of 1865, after 4 long years of fighting and more than 500,000 deaths, the Civil War is over, but the country is now embroiled in a new war.
The federal government finds itself facing exactly the situation that it had wanted to avoid, which is a general Indian war, that the violence has really spiraled out of control. And so it sends peace negotiators back to Colorado Territory, uses William Bent, George Bent's father, as an envoy. And the Cheyennes, particularly the Cheyenne peace chiefs, again, including Chief Black Kettle, are willing to listen.
The United States admits responsibility for the Sand Creek Massacre and offers compensation in exchange for peace. Arapaho Chief Little Raven expresses his distrust over the treaty.
There's something very strong for us. There at Sand Creek is our chief, Left Hand, White Antelope, and many other chiefs lie there. Our women and children lie there. Our lodges were destroyed there, and our horses were taken from us there. And I do not feel disposed to go right off into a new country and leave them. Chief Little Raven.
General Sanborn offers little solace, telling the delegation, "We have all got to submit to the tide of emigration and civilization."
They did something at the Little Arkansas that had never happened before. They promised annuities and reparations to the families who were killed at Sand Creek.
It's a treaty claim that still hasn't been extinguished. It's still out there.
George Bent lived through an incredible lifetime. In the nearly 70 years that he spent on Earth, he went as a veteran of the Civil War, through the Indian Wars, and was a warrior to the very end of his life when he died in 1918.
He set out to tell the history of his people, and he wrote letters to George Bird Grinnell, George Hyde, these pioneering anthropologists and ethnologists, and he poured out his soul to them. And it is through George Bent that we located the site of the Sand Creek Massacre.
On the eastern plains of Colorado, sand, clay, and soil hold memories of what happened on November 29th, 1864. In the mingling of artifacts, ornaments, and armaments, a story emerges, filled in by those who experienced it then and now.
All the time we've been carrying it. We still carry it today. Now, I think it's time to heal that. We will carry that for a long, long time yet.
The Sand Creek Massacre site near Eads, Colorado, is a place that holds powerful emotional connections. It is also a place for remembrance and a place for healing.
It's just something that's important in our history. To know where you're going, you got to know where you came from.
After 150 years, I believe it's time that someone actually heard the real story.
I want my people to be proud and say, hey, we survived all these attempts at genocide, and we're still alive. We still talk our language. We still know our ways.
When I read about things like that happening in other countries, it just makes me angry, you know. We should never forget. Those things should never happen to anyone.
See, that's the scariest part about Sand Creek, in a lot of ways, is that it reminds us that we are all capable of incredible evil if we are not careful, if we do not have remain committed to the core principles that we're supposed to live by.
The Sand Creek Massacre spiritual healing run and walk finishes at the Colorado State Capitol by the Civil War Monument. A place honoring not only those who fought and died in the Civil War, but a place where a massacre is acknowledged, and a place where tradition and culture touch generations so that they may thrive into the future.
嘿哈呀嘿呀哦，哦嗨呀嘿耶，嘿哈呀嘿呀哦，嘿哈呀嘿，嘿吼喂哟，嘿耶，哈呀嘿呀嘿呀嘿哟，嘿耶。